Hello! Back in early February, I made the decision to install this 120-volt plug-in heat pump water heater in my Chicagoland townhome. This is a decision that many people, including the plumber I hired to install this, would call quite strange, because you see, these things work by sucking heat out of the air, meaning they make the air colder. And Chicagoland is a cold climate. Townhomes are limited on space, which is why this thing is shoved into a utility closet, which makes installation more difficult. And that utility closet is in my living space. So it is going to make my home colder when it generates hot water, which is a little weird in the wintertime. But because energy is energy and water is water, you can do a little math to figure out how much colder it could possibly make your home, and that math will tell you it can't possibly make it that much colder, and indeed, that is the case. So long story short, I don't regret this at all. If you got here without seeing the main channel video, you might want to check that out. And full disclosure, there are trade-offs involved here, some of which are significant. But the whole they make the space colder as they run is really a nothing burger, and that's why I have my laptop out. We're going to look through some of the data that I collected, which I did not put into the main channel video because it's just a nothing burger. But in addition to looking at this data, I'm also going to go over some frequently asked questions from my Patreon members, and I will also talk about the story I teased involving Lowe's and how they managed to lose this thing for a couple of weeks. That was an absolute nightmare, and Lowe's should be ashamed of themselves for how they handled this. But we'll get to that later. First, something which I only explained as it being a big deal, but didn't explain why it's actually a big deal for me, is the 120-volt part of this. So, the reason why these 120-volt models are such a cool thing is because there's a lot of folks that have electrical panels which are at or near capacity. And even if you aren't, you have to run a new circuit for a 240-volt water heater, which is difficult and expensive. I am at capacity. In fact, I'm probably a little over capacity. I only have 100 amp electrical service because in Chicagoland, most homes have historically been built, and a lot still are getting built, where gas is used for anything that needs heat. So all of my appliances, which could be gas, were gas, including the dryer. And because I have a 32 amp car charging circuit, well, it's actually a 50 amp circuit, but I have a 32 amp charger on it, and I now have an electric stove, by the book, my panel is very close to fully loaded. In fact, it might technically be overloaded. I hired an electrician to install the circuit for the stove, and I would describe that electrician as fairly fly-by-night because no permits were filed or anything. It just happened. But I am personally perfectly fine with having the panel being technically overloaded because the way we do load calculations here in the US is completely stupid. I'm going to make a main channel video about this at some point. But for a quick explanation, if you look at my panel right now, okay, if I'm charging the car, it's going to pull 32 amps. If I'm running the air conditioner, it's probably going to pull another 12, so that's up to 44 amps. My stove can, in theory, pull 40 amps. So if I'm using the stove while the air conditioner is running and charging the car, then I could be at 80, 90 amps, which is at risk of the main breaker tripping, especially because of the other loads in the home. But load calculations currently say a stove is a 40 amp load, even though the only situation where it will ever actually be a 40 amp load is if you are preheating the oven and all 4 burners are on high. If you're using one burner, even one of the biggest burners, the max the stove is going to draw is about 12 amps. So it's just... Anyway, the way we do load calculations is very silly, and I've done videos in the past on smart breaker panels, but quite frankly, we shouldn't even need to go to that extent. We should be doing load calculations differently. But I'll stop talking about that. The important thing is, I am not in a position to run another 30 amp circuit to that utility closet, especially because down the road, I am going to do that when I install a heat pump with backup resistive heat. And I basically want to be a case study of how to fully electrify a home in a cold climate with only 100 amp service. It's definitely possible, but if I were to switch it to an electric water heater, then it would be a case of you now absolutely need a service upgrade. A 120 volt model just needs an outlet handy, and they only draw a maximum of 9 amps, and in this case that's actually unique to this one because it has backup resistive elements. In the heat pump operation it will draw 4.5, maybe 5. So that's why these are such a big deal. I already had an outlet. In fact, there's 2 circuits in this closet, which I'll talk about later, but there's nothing to do electrically with these things so long as you have an outlet within reach. I am personally a little bit irritated because since they only draw 9 amps, it would be perfectly fine to use these with a decent extension cord, but of course the manual tells you not to do that, and I understand why, but it comes with, I think it's an 8-foot power cord, so you have pretty good leeway. And running a new outlet somewhere is pretty trivial to do, so But anyway, that's the reason why the 120 volt models are such a big deal, because you basically don't need to do anything for them except potentially figure out ducting for the air situation and run a condensate drain. It's almost plug and play, which is very cool. And I knew based on my usage patterns and just history with my family that like, there's no way I'm ever going to get close to running out of hot water with one of these things. And also, a lot of the people who have 240 volt hybrid models, which have high-powered heating elements for periods of high demand, have told me they just set it to stay on heat pump mode all the time because they've been monitoring its energy draw, and it will decide to switch to resistive mode at times when it definitely didn't need to, and they never had any issues keep forcing it on heat pump only mode. So that's why I was like, well, then a 120 volt model will be fine. And it is. I truly think it is. But that's the first thing I wanted to explain because someone was asking, why wouldn't you just install a 240 volt circuit? Well, there's a lot of situations where that's not financially feasible or literally not possible. And I am in a gray area where like I could potentially make that work with some energy monitoring stuff. But by the time I'm in that situation, I'm only going to do that for the backup heat for the heat pump, which I intend to install fairly soon, but I am looking for the market to get a little more sane. It is currently not that sane. But anyway, I will stop talking about that. Let's move on to the next thing. All right, so one thing which I didn't mention in the main channel video, and I've had some people wondering why I didn't, was the use of thermostatic mixing valves. Now, I've talked about these before in my videos on electrification, but there's a reason why they didn't come up here, and I'll explain that in a moment. But first, to explain what they are, using a thermostatic mixing valve allows you to set a different temperature for the water inside the tank than the temperature you actually get distributed throughout your home. They'll typically be installed above your water heater or somewhere near it, and they'll be able to mix incoming cold water with the outgoing hot water, and they have a thermostat to actually set the resulting temperature from that mix. So this would allow you to, say, have a 40-gallon water heater filled with very hot water, like 160, 170 degrees Fahrenheit, way too hot to be safe. It would burn you, but the thermostatic mixing valve will just mix cold water with it as it goes out, and throughout your home you don't actually get anywhere near that hot water. And this has the effect of artificially increasing the size of the tank, because you might be getting 1 gallon per minute coming out of the water heater, but with an extra half a gallon per minute, only about 2/3 is actually coming out of the water heater, if that makes sense. But in the case of heat pump water heaters, at least the ones that are commonly available here in the US, doing that is very much a case of diminishing returns and also only kind of solves the problem. So the big trade-off with these things is their slowness. They are very slow to recover hot water. If you use a thermostatic mixing valve, you will be able to extend the size of the tank, but you're not actually making it recover any faster. So what might happen is, okay, if I were to set the tank to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which is as high as this model will let me go, well, okay, I might be able to have an effective tank size of maybe 90 gallons from the 66 gallons out of here. But then when it's going to recharge that, it just extends the time it takes to recharge. So you're kind of just robbing Peter to pay Paul in that situation. A thermostatic mixing valve it extends the operating time, but it also extends the recharging time. And that's why I didn't really talk about it, because it solves some particular problems, but it doesn't actually solve the slowness problem of these things. It just means, for instance, with my bathtub, I've discovered it draws about half of the water from the tank. If you had a bigger soaking tub, like let's say it needed 50 gallons, well, in the case of my water heater in the winter, if it was on full hot, then it's going to take the water heater probably 8 hours to recharge from that. And if you had a thermostatic mixing valve and you were keeping the water inside the tank so hot that you only needed to draw out the same 30 gallons that I need, well, it takes more time to get that 30 gallons up to a higher temperature. So yes, you will have used less of the water in the tank, but you haven't actually decreased the amount of time the water heater will take to recharge what you used. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a limitation of the input power, which really matters here. And the water heater, the tank of water, is a thermal battery. So you can only charge that battery as fast as the charger, which is the heat pump, can replenish energy. And by using a thermostatic mixing valve, you've made the battery bigger, but you haven't made the charger any faster. So it only kind of solves the problem, and only in certain situations. That's reason number one why I didn't mention them in this case. And I will note that A.O. Smith says you can use these. It talks in the manual, it talks about the potential of using these to extend the hot water time, but because of the charger's not any faster, it's just going to take long. It's still going to take the same amount of time for it to recover water that you use. It's only a half measure in my mind, and I didn't really think it's worth discussing in this case. But the other thing, and this has to do with the data logging, has to do with efficiency. And this is the thing that I mentioned kind of in passing, where I said 130 Fahrenheit is the highest I would set this for efficiency's sake. Let me explain why I said that. Okay, we are looking at the data logging software that you use with my little cheap USB data loggers. I could do more fancy stuff with this if I exported to Excel and stuff like that, but I can't be bothered. This is Connextras. And I didn't even bother on the main channel. But what we are looking at now, this is the exhaust temperature. So there's a logger. You may have spotted the zip tie in the main channel video. There was a logger placed on top of the exhaust collar from this water heater. So this logger will show us the temperature of the air coming out of the water heater. And what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that it increases over time. Let me zoom in here so you can see this a little better. Okay, so here, for instance, shortly after the water heater switched on, the air coming out of it was 49.2 degrees Fahrenheit. But as time went on, the air temperature coming out was going up. And this is the opposite of what you would expect, because it's making the room it's in colder, so the air that it's ingesting is getting colder, and you would expect, if it's pulling the same amount of energy out of that air, then the air coming out should also be colder. But it's not, it's getting warmer. And what this tells us is its ability to absorb energy from the air starts to diminish as the temperature inside the tank goes up. And this is what we would expect from a heat pump. The bigger the temperature differential is between the cold side and the hot side, the harder it has to work, and the lower the coefficient of performance becomes. This is why we saw power draw go up essentially linearly as it increased the temperature in the tank, because the high side pressure starts to climb, and that makes the compressor work harder. So we are seeing two things happen at the same time. The power draw that it's taking from the wall is going up, and the energy it's actually able to capture from the air is diminishing. And this is the mechanism which makes COP start to fall when the, for example, outside air temperature starts to drop. In this case, that's not what's happening. The indoor air temperature is the same, but the water that we're heating is so much hotter that it has basically the same effect as a heat pump running in extremely cold temperatures. It starts to struggle absorbing heat. So we see the coefficient of performance start to fall off the higher the water temperature you set. And so remember how in the video it would basically shut off at 460 watts of power when set to 120 Fahrenheit, but it would go up to 500 watts when set to 130 Fahrenheit. The highest it will let you go is 150 Fahrenheit, and I did not test what the power draw is in that situation. But assuming it's the same linear increase. It's going to be pulling near 600 watts, which is, that's not a crazy amount of power draw, but it will also be absorbing less heat from the air. So you really do lose efficiency as you increase the water inside the tank. So the combination of a thermostatic mixing valve just makes the battery bigger. It doesn't actually make the charger any faster. And you start to lose efficiency the higher you set the temperature, is ultimately why I didn't talk about thermostatic mixing valves. It appears to be the case, at least for the all-in-one units we can get here in the United States, that they're really just not designed for that. And that's why their tanks are so big. That's why this thing is so gigantic. They are essentially the same water heater technology that you are used to, as in it just has a volume of hot water ready to go at whatever temperature you want. And you could use a thermostatic mixing valve to extend the amount of time you have available of hot water, but in doing that, you are also extending the amount of time it takes to recharge the tank. So in my opinion, it doesn't really do anything unless you have a usage pattern which is like, in the morning, everybody uses a ton of hot water, and then nobody's going to use any more hot water until the next day. In which case, if you have a 16-hour recharge time, which could be the case if you have it going to 150 degrees Fahrenheit in the dead of winter, it won't really matter. But in my personal opinion, and again, this is my personal opinion, you can disagree, it just doesn't really make sense with these 120 volt models. They are just slow, and the thermostatic mixing valve doesn't fix that problem. It just makes the battery bigger. It's the same effect as making the tank bigger. And in fact, I didn't talk about this, but the 80-gallon models that exist, they do the same thing. They buy you more operating time, but unless the heat pump is actually larger, which I don't think it is, but I don't know that for sure, it's going to be just as slow as the 66-gallon model. So it really is the speed of the charger, meaning the heat pump, which is your limiting factor here. And basically, you're only going to be able to get 2 full uses of hot water per day, set to 30 degrees, or set to 130 Fahrenheit. If you use the thermostatic mixing valve, you're only stretching the time it takes to recharge the tank, if that makes sense. So that's why I didn't talk about it. It's ultimately a thing that I don't think is very relevant for this situation. Another thing I want to clarify, I am aware that other manufacturers do have ducting solutions available for their models. I didn't mean to suggest that A.O. Smith is the only one that lets you duct the water heater. It's just, for instance, the Rheem models, which have a side discharge, I think it's a discharge on the side, not the intake, that limits your options. And like in my case, it wouldn't even work because it would go right into the furnace, which is right next to. So it really is, the unique thing about the A.O. Smith models is that both intake and exhaust are on the top, and you don't have to deal with the curvature of the tank. So yes, the Rheem units have adapters. I don't know if they come with them or not, but in my assessment, the A.O. Smith configuration with the 2 collars on top is just a lot more flexible and a lot easier to adapt to different situations than having an intake on the top and exhaust on the side. Okay, so here's another data set here, and this is one where I put a data logger inside the ductwork in my home. I took one of the floor registers in my living room, just took the grate off and dropped the logger down into the duct. And I did this because I wanted to see the effect of the furnace coming on in response to the heat pump water heater. So quick recap, I did this in a completely insane way, but I'm me, so that's what I was gonna do. I was just having the water heater discharge air into the closet, which meant that inside that closet, it got really cold. And because of the dead zone situation in that room, my furnace wasn't actually able to get a lot of that air sucked up and blown throughout the rest of my house. So I added a bathroom fan on a temperature controller to move air from inside the closet to outside the closet above the furnace intake. And I added a second thermostat, just a basic analog thermostat wired across R and G to force the furnace fan on when the temperature inside the closet got below 55 degrees, is what I set it to. I don't know what it actually kicked on at because it was a bimetal analog thermostat. Which means, for those following along, my furnace is now controlled by 3 things. my actual thermostat upstairs, the humidistat, which can force it on, and it does so every hour, which we will see in this data set, and the second thermostat. So boy, is my furnace hooked up in a totally weird way. But in this data, this looks incredibly spiky because when the heat comes on, the temperature goes above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So we kind of have to just ignore all the high marks here. That's not what I wanted to look at anyway. But in this data set, we can see that my solution did work. But we can also see how little effect it's going to create in the rest of the house because of how temperature differentials work. So first of all, this stretch of data on the early side after February 14th, apparently it was a very mild stretch of weather because the furnace was barely kicking on. It got much colder again here. And again, as I said in the main channel video, I don't keep my home at a stable temperature, so that's why it varies so much. But for now, I want to zoom in on this section here. This is wonderful software, which works really great. Okay, so we can see these little dips here. This is probably the most significant one here, where the heat wasn't running, so the temperature in my home was slowly dropping. But then all of a sudden, we see this sudden dip down here. This is going to be from the furnace fan kicking on and moving air from the room the water heater is in throughout the rest of my home. And because the air in that room is cooler than everywhere else, because the water heater is running, we will see the drop in temperature. But I want to point out here, it's a really tiny drop. We were at about 65 Fahrenheit before it kicked on, and then it bottomed out at 62 Fahrenheit. So we had a 3-degree Fahrenheit temperature drop inside the ductwork. And the reason why that's important to note is because you are not going to feel that. That temperature differential is way too small to really notice a cooling effect from the furnace fan running. You will just notice air movement more than you will notice that actual cooling. But this does show that the furnace fan kicking on and the weird bathroom fan situation, which I am going to correct, it was working. The whole point of that, to get air from inside the furnace closet out of the furnace closet and then have the furnace suck it up and blow it to the rest of the house, was working. But we can see that the effect is just super, super minor. You can't even really see it at all when the weather was cold and the furnace kept coming on at a regular interval. You can really only notice it when the weather was mild and the temperature was low. Oh, and now is where I admit a bit of a fib in the main channel video script. I said that I did all this nonsense because of how the pinball room, which is what I call the room the water heater is in because it's got pinball machines in there, really only gets noticeably colder in spring and fall, and that's why I did all that nonsense. But I actually did all that nonsense basically right after installing the water heater. It's just the actual need for that nonsense is only apparent when my HVAC system is not really running. And that's what we can kind of see in this data set here. Because in the early part of February, it was mild weather and the heat just wasn't coming on very much. Later in the month, when it got cold again, you really can't see any sort of effect here in the living room. Maybe here, but again, the furnace wasn't running very much. And also, I want to point out these little spikes here. That is from the humidistat calling for the furnace fan, and then I believe calling for humidification. When the humidifier is running, there is some evaporative cooling happening because that's what happens as water evaporates, but the water is also 130 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very hot water. So as it's blowing air through the evaporative pad, I think that air is actually increasing in temperature slightly. I don't know that for sure. We could be seeing a slight bump and then a drop, but I think it's actually heating up. But I just wanted to explain, we're seeing this little bumpiness here rather than a straight line down because of the humidifier or the humidistat calling for the furnace to come on. But yes, basically I just wanted to show this data set so you can see the whole furnace kicking on to move air throughout the rest of the house works, but the effect that it actually has on the air temperature coming out of the ducts is just about a 3-degree drop, which is you know, kind of what I would expect because the air temperature in that room it's a few degrees colder than the rest of the house. But it is, with the vent set up, it is basically sucking up all of the output air, not necessarily from the water heater, but all of the output air from the bathroom fan, pulling air out of that closet. Anyway, I'm talking about this too much. Let's move on to something else. This here is another data set, the same thing where I put the logger inside a vent, but this was upstairs in my bedroom. And, you know, it's basically the same effect. We can see these little dips here from a few degrees. But, you know, then once the water heater shuts off, in fact, I should point, let's look closely at this. We can kind of see in this little bit of data here the net effect of the water heater cooling the house, because this should be a perfectly linear dip, and I bet that point there is a little bit lower than it should be from the water heater coming on. But basically the effect is, let's see, we had 65.7 there and 66.6. So we maybe had, well, I know, we'll see what we should expect. So we had, what is this? 2147 to, so basically it ran for 2 hours. This was probably just the water heater coming on. It probably ran earlier in the day. 2 hours is about the minimum amount of time it ever runs. So in this linear temperature drop here from 1700, so it's 67.5 to 1900. So basically we had a 1 degree temperature drop in 2 hours. And then we started at 66.4 and we ended up at 65.7. Yeah, I'm not even sure it had a noticeable net effect. It kind of looks like it visually. It kind of looks like this is a tick lower than it should be, but we're talking about splitting hairs here. This is what I meant about it doesn't impact the temperature anywhere else in the house. Even considering I installed or I bodged some stuff to make the furnace come on to move air out of that room, it just doesn't really matter. It's just not a relevant effect. Yeah, it's so minor. It just doesn't matter. Now, let me see. This is probably a situation of it using more hot water. This was it running for a longer period of time later into the night. But again, so with the outdoor temperatures, let's see, we're at 3 in the morning, it's 65 to 5 in the morning. It's 64.8, is that really it? Okay, so we might have had half a degree temperature drop in 2 hours. We're at 67 before that last blip. Was that 17? Oh, 19. So this is 7 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And we only dropped 3 degrees. 67 to 65. Not even. It's just nothing. It's a nothing burger. This is what I meant. It's such a minuscule effect on the average temperature of your home because that's just what you would expect. It's only got the chilling power, the cooling power of a small window unit, which is only big enough to cool one room. And in an entire house, it's just small potatoes. And just for the benefit of people who didn't see the main channel video, this list is the temperature inside the pinball room. And this got deleted from the script, so I should explain. That room is always a few degrees cooler than the rest of the house in the wintertime, honestly, even in the summer, because it is on the slab. The floor is concrete, and it's also partially below grade. So that room is just always a little bit cooler than the rest of the house. So you would expect it to work like this. And this is, I set the data logger up differently. That's why in the file it says asterisk. So February 14th is all the way over here. So this is the part of this is the time when the furnace wasn't really running very much. So I want to zoom into here so we can actually get a better effect or better sense of what the water heater is doing in that room. Yeah, so in this stretch, the temperature in that room is much more stable than it appears elsewhere, just because the temperature outside was much more mild. And even in this case, the water heater is just not creating very noticeable dips. The room wasn't getting anywhere near as cold as it was when it was actually colder outside, despite the fact that the heat's barely coming on. So yes, I don't keep my home at like 60 degrees, but it's just that room is colder. This is probably here. I think this was that stretch where the water heater was running for a while, and it bottomed out at 60. So it's a very small effect. It really is just a very small effect. So again, there's probably not all that much of a reason to go into this data really far, but this is the logger that was zip tied to the furnace intake. So that return grill, this was a logger zip tied to it, which tells us the air temperature that the furnace is ingesting. And also we can kind of see, I need to zoom in to make it more visible, but this is where the air coming out of the vent from the bathroom fan is blowing directly onto this temperature logger. So we will see the dips of the water heater running more clearly. Let me go back to the 14th of February with that period where the heat wasn't running very much. But hopefully you can see through this data why I said in the video, if the HVAC system is running with any normal frequency, as in it's cold enough that the furnace is coming on regularly, or now in the summer it's cool or hot enough outside that the air conditioning is coming on regularly, the HVAC is just mixing so much air around the house that the impact of the water heater itself is just almost impossible to notice anywhere except the room that it's in. And so yeah, here we can clearly see the water heater switched on here. And actually, this is kind of interesting to point out because we can see, yeah, we had a dip in temperature as the water heater kicked on, but then once the furnace fan came on in response to the thermostat inside, and it starts drawing air through that vent, which is mostly coming down the stairs from the rest of my home, the temperature just flatlines. So we were initially at 63.5, and then we dropped down to 61, and then it just flatlined there. So again, this isn't representative of the temperature in the room because we're seeing the air coming down the stairs mixing with it, but it does, I think, show that once the furnace fan kicks on and it starts mixing air with the rest of the house, the localized effect of the water heater just doesn't really matter to anywhere else. Or what I mean is, it shows how localized the effect of the water heater is. Despite the fact that it forces the furnace fan on to try to bring more air from upstairs down into the room and get the air in that room up to the rest of the house, it just doesn't really seem to impact the air temperature, even though, you know, it was unusually warm for February, but it was still, I think I looked at historical weather data, it might have hit 50 degrees Fahrenheit, so it was like early spring temperatures outside. It's just the potatoes. They're so small. And just as a final look before I stop screen recording here, again, this is back to that data set of the ambient temperature in that room. And we are just not seeing any, even in this whole section where the heat was barely running at all, we see these little dips from the water heater kicking on, but they're nowhere near as big as the dips that we see just from me letting the furnace, you know, lowering the thermostat temperature overnight. The air leaving the room just because, you know, through the slab and through the walls from the furnace not running is so much bigger of an effect than the heat the water heater is pulling out of the room. Well, I knew I'd forget something. I mentioned there are two circuits inside this closet. Directly above the water heater is a power outlet, which was there for the old water heater, which might sound weird because it was a gas one, but it had a powered vent blower and thus it needed electricity. That outlet, however, is on the same circuit as the rest of the room and the garage. And over the winter, I have a space heater set to the 900 watt output in the garage and on a temperature controller to make sure the garage doesn't ever get below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that means it rarely ever runs, but if it were running while the water heater was running and I was doing literally anything else in that room, well, that circuit breaker would probably trip. So the other outlet in here is on the same circuit as my furnace. And that is a critical to not have trip circuit because, I need the furnace to work in the winter. So before I plugged the water heater into it, I used an amp clamp to determine how much current my furnace and the humidifier, which is the other thing plugged into here, actually draws, and it was only about 4 amps. So if the water heater were in resistive mode, we'd be pretty close to the 12 amp limit, but we still wouldn't quite hit it. And since I almost never intend to have it in resistive mode anyway, I felt comfortable having it plugged into here. In the end, it didn't really matter, but I just wanted to mention it. And now I'll finish up with the absolute clusterfuck, which was Lowe's somehow managing to lose a water heater for 2 weeks. So let me preface this by explaining I elected to just buy the thing and hire a plumber separately for 2 reasons. One, plumbers in this area, as I said, they're not very familiar with these and they will call you crazy for wanting one. To quote my plumber, gas is king, even though I would rather not burn stuff just to live my life, and that's why I'm interested in this thing in the first place. Because of that, I knew it was going to be potentially a problem to get a plumber to actually come out and give me a bid. Now, I could have just bought it from Lowe's and gone through their whole system, which is supposed to just, they charge some money for installation and they will send a plumber to you. But because I had the weird particularities of the furnace pipe needs to be removed and reattached, and there was going to be more time and materials involved, I didn't want to just surprise them with that or potentially have issues with that. So the combination of plumbers are not very familiar with these yet, and there was weird particular stuff with my installation, was why I decided to just buy it, have it delivered, and then hire a plumber. And sure enough, the first plumber I called outright just refused to even talk to me. Even though I explained, it's got normal topside water connections, it's just physically large, and there's a couple of extra things that we need to do because of that, he was just like, I'm not interested. In the end, I ended up accepting a bid before it was delivered. So the potential situation, which I thought I might run into, which was, please just come over to my home. I will show you what I want. I already bought it. That's how serious I am. Let's do this. That didn't end up happening. I accepted a bid before it was actually delivered. But we scheduled installation for 3-4 days after it was supposed to arrive. I gave myself and the plumber a little bit of a buffer, knowing there could be some problems. Oh boy, were there problems. So the Lowe's website just kept saying it's scheduled to be delivered on, I think, the 17th of January, maybe the 19th. I don't remember for sure. But when I would check the order progress, it just said it's en route from the supplier, it will be delivered on the 19th. And it just kept saying it's on time. And I was like, this is peculiar. So as we're getting closer to the install date, I started calling the store. Strike one, every time you call the local store, you have to talk to a robot to convince it that actually you have a problem. I could even say, I need to talk to somebody in appliances about a problem with my order. And the robot would be like, oh, I can help with that, even though it couldn't. So I had to fight with this robot every single time just to get through to somebody at the local store. That is a horrible customer service experience, and I hope the people at Lowe's know that. I wasted probably over an hour just talking to this damn robot because of all the times I had to call. So let's go through that. So first of all, we're getting close to the install date, and I start calling to try to get an order update on this thing because the tracker on the website is basically just stuck, and it had been stuck for like a week. Somebody at Lowe's corporate told me they gave me the number to A.O. Smith and the purchase order number for my actual, the actual PO that Lowe's gave to A.O. Smith, they gave to me. So I called A.O. Smith. It was nice of them to put that on me. And I called A.O. Smith, and I talked to a very lovely person there. I was like, yes, Lowe's gave me this information. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with this water heater. Well, the person at A.O. Smith let me know that it had been delivered to the Rockford Distribution Center like well over a week ago. Oh, really? So it was out of A.O. Smith's hands. They had already delivered it to the Rockford Distribution Center, which, to clarify, is Lowe's business. Like, it is their distribution center up in Rockford, and they deliver stuff from there, apparently, to the stores in the Chicagoland area. And after finding out that information, I was like, okay, so I called the local store again, and I said, okay, they're telling me that you guys already have it. What's going on? And remember, I had to talk to a robot again to get through to someone in appliances. Once I did, and I explained, I've been told from A.O. Smith that you guys have it, but your system is not saying anything to reflect that. What's going on? Well, basically, I got told, well, I can't see anything, but it's going to arrive on time. So some more time passes, and again, it is now the day, it's 2 days before it's supposed to be delivered. And so I call the store again have to convince a robot I need to talk to somebody. And I say, look, my plumber is scheduled to install this the day after tomorrow. It is now already a day late. I need some reassurance that it is actually going to be delivered tomorrow. In all of these interactions, the people at the local store kept telling me they would call me back. That never happened. Then, when I finally didn't get called back again, I called, I think at like 7 p.m. or something, and I was told by someone there, we have it, it is going to be on a truck tomorrow, it will be delivered to you. After I got that information, the online tracker updated and said, it will be delivered tomorrow. In fact, I got a delivery window and a text which said, your delivery is scheduled for between, I don't know, like 7:30 and 11:30 a.m. tomorrow. And I thought, great, finally, it's on my way. Would you be surprised to learn that it wasn't? Because it wasn't. The next day, the delivery window comes and goes, and I call the store again, talk to a robot again. At this point, I was already up to at least 2 hours on the phone with Lowe's, both corporate and the local store. And I said, look, you have told me it's coming today, but it's not here, so where is it? And long story short, it turns out the manager at the local store was trying her best to get an answer for me, but the Rockford Distribution Center wasn't answering either her phone calls or her emails. So somehow this enormous water heater was sitting at the Rockford Distribution Center in a corner somewhere, and people just kept looking at it and not realizing this shouldn't be here. I have no idea, but there was just failure after failure after failure. So I had to call my plumber and say, I'm so sorry, but we need to reschedule because it's not here. So Lowe's wasted hours of my time, potentially a day of my plumber's time, and it was just egregiously bad. This was so incredibly bad. If anybody from Lowe's is listening, I was trying to get through. I was trying my hardest, and I talked to the customer service. It was to the point where the customer service people even acknowledged something terrible has happened here. I've logged in your profile, or in this case, that you are eligible for compensation. So call us back and we'll give you some compensation. That compensation ended up being a $50 Lowe's gift card, which was insulting for all of the time that I wasted on this. And when I talked to, and I should be clear, everyone at the customer service line at Lowe's, once I finally got through to them, was delightful and very sympathetic, and truly made me feel like they understood this is falling apart. We have no idea why this is happening to you, but they had absolutely no ability to escalate this or to figure out how to get in touch with somebody who could actually solve the problem. And so I was basically in the dark the entire time until magically, and remember how I said nobody ever called me back? The manager at the store said she would call me back once it is at the store. That didn't happen. So the day before it was supposed to be delivered again, and remember, I got a text giving me a delivery window on the original day it was supposed to be there. The systems that Lowe's has going on with this are just so fundamentally broken. And when I tried to talk to or when I was talking to the customer service people at corporate, I said, I really want, like, I'm obviously very mad that this has happened to me. But what's most important to me is that you recognize this happened and you figure out why this happened so it doesn't happen again. And I would really like to talk to somebody in the customer service department, like the VP of customer service or whatever, to walk through all of this. Because you have wasted so much of my time, and I'll tell you what, I'm probably never going to shop at Lowe's again. And that's not too much of a flex because I'm in a weird bit of a hole where there isn't a Lowe's around me for some reason. There aren't that many Lowe's around Chicagoland. I don't know how that happened, but there's only a few. And so it's not like it would be convenient to me anyway. And the only reason I ordered it from Lowe's is because they're the only big box store that sells the A.O. Smith brand. Anyway, it was just utterly terrible. And if somebody at Lowe's happens to get wind of this video and is empowered to send this to somebody at Lowe's corporate who can maybe look back at this file if they can find it, I'm not going to give you the case number or anything like that just to protect my identity being an internet person. But like, it was egregiously bad. This is the worst service failure I've ever encountered in my life, which was particularly annoying because this was a over $3,000 purchase with the extended warranty. And I don't remember if delivery was included or not, but they had over $3,000 this whole time. And there was no sense of urgency to figure out where the hell is this water heater. Nobody could get in touch with the distribution center to prod them and get them to figure out where is this water heater. And it was just like, I felt completely disrespected and like my time was completely worthless to this company. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Not impressed at all with how that worked out and the absolute clusterfuck of a customer service failure. I'm very impressed by all of the individuals at the customer support line who were truly I have no complaints about anybody I talked to, but nobody is empowered to actually fix this problem, to actually escalate the situation to somebody who can do something. And as someone who is from a hospitality background, I used to work in the hotel industry where I was literally the person you talked to fix problems. It irritates me so much when there is a service failure like this and the systems are designed in such a way that nobody can actually do anything. It is frankly unacceptable that Lowe's customer service people do not have a direct line to a manager at the distribution center that they can call and be like, what's happening with this? The fact that it's unacceptable that the local store couldn't get in touch with the distribution center. Like, what on earth is happening? It does feel like things are falling apart lately. And, this was 6 months ago, more than. And who knows what things are like now. But it is just unbelievably unacceptable that nobody at Lowe's, at the store or at customer service or whatever, is able to grab the bull by the horns and find the phone number of the person, like the manager of the Rockford Distribution Center. Why was nobody able to get in touch with them? Apparently they're supposed to be answering emails and they weren't, but okay, that's one thing, but there should be a phone number that somebody at Lowe's can call and somebody at the distribution center can pick up and talk to somebody and figure out, where is this water heater? So yeah, this is definitely just me venting about the situation, but oh boy, it was so bad. And I really just hate how the world works like this now. It's all of these corporations have created these structures that so long as everything is going through this structure, okay, you'll be fine. But as soon as there is a problem, you have to fight robots to let you talk to, even something I would expect, right? their stupid AI robot to realize this phone number keeps calling a lot. Maybe just pass it through. Maybe listen to the person who says, I need to speak to someone in appliances about a problem with my order. Right? Like, none of this stuff was designed in any way to anticipate problems. It's absolutely just about deflection. At least that's what it seems like to me. And despite the fact that once I do get through to some very helpful people, the fact that they can't actually help is just unacceptable. And my word, every business out there should learn some, I've talked about this before, but every business out there should have somebody who knows about the hospitality industry, particularly hotels, and how they handle customer service and customer service failures. For instance, the service recovery grid, which is a thing that everybody in hotels understands, where it's a simple matrix. How bad of a problem is this? And is it our fault or not? And it's just a little four-way grid. If it's a small problem and it's not our fault, you do what's called empathize. And you say, oh, I'm very sorry to hear that. I hope things work out. If it's a small problem and it is your fault, you fix it. That's all you have to do. Fix it. Very easy. If it's a big problem and it's not your fault, you can do what's called a hero treatment, where you can try to fix it for that person and you will get tons of kudos for that. And if it's a big problem and it's your fault, you roll out the red carpet. That's the service recovery grid. I'll try to throw up a picture if I can find that. And this, like, it is so common in the hotel industry, and it feels like just common sense. And yet, I've never seen it implemented outside of hospitality. So Lowe's, maybe you can learn something from that. If you screwed something up as bad as losing a whole water heater, it should not be a Byzantine experience for someone to try to figure out how to make this work. And I hope you can tell, because I'm only telling this story now 6 months later, that I wasn't throwing my weight around at them and being like, you could be in for a bit of a nightmare if I wanted to complain about this on social media. But I didn't do that. I am doing it now because I want everybody to know this is the normal experience for someone from Lowe's if they have a problem with their order, that the customer service people are not empowered to fix anything, and they can't even get in touch with the sub-departments of their organization. And right, that's just what blows my mind. When I was working in the hotel industry, but hotels in general, I had the phone number of our general manager. And if there was a problem, I could call him and just be like, hey, there's a big problem happening. And everybody in the corporate chain of customer service in our brand knew our local phone number and could get in touch with somebody at the hotel who could then connect them through to our general manager, or at least leave a voicemail or something. Like, it's bonkers that the response from the manager in the local store was, I'm sorry, but the Rockford distribution center is not answering my phone calls or emails. Like, what? That's just frankly unacceptable, period. But also, like, you know, I asked her, has this happened before? Like, what is happening here? It was just absolute madness. But anyway, I think that's the end of this video. I'm gonna double check to make sure there wasn't something else I wanted to talk about, but thanks for watching. If you are looking for a 120 volt plug-in heat pump water heater, given the, let's just say, less than stellar reputation with the A.O. Smith brand and their heat pump water heaters, I would maybe not get theirs. I would like to see Rheem and maybe Bradford White. I think they also do heat pump water heaters. I would like to see them do what A.O. Smith has done, where they offer a hybrid option with backup resistive elements and with simpler ducting, because it really is just the ideal configuration in my mind for a heat pump water heater. It's just, it doesn't seem like A.O. Smith is having the best time with these. There's a lot of like Reddit threads about them. So I've been lucky with mine so far. And I knew going, in fact, the plumber even warned me. He was like, have you looked at the reviews for this thing? I said, yes, I have. I'm aware. And I just took a risk on it. Because these things really are like, no plumber is going to recommend one to you, at least not right now. Maybe a very energy conscious plumber who's interested in stuff like newer technology might analyze the trade-offs for you. But for now, plumbers are mostly concerned with you having a water heater that you're happy with. And I can understand why they would want to steer people away from one of these, but I knew what I was getting into. And it was frustrating how difficult it was to find a plumber that was willing to just do that. And for those asking, like, typically I'm fine DIYing stuff, but I don't touch plumbing. That's the one thing that I'm like, no, I hire professionals for that because I don't know what I'm doing with plumbing. It's so much, in fact, you might have seen it's ProPress fittings on all the, I think it's ProPress, is that the right brand? On all the stuff, it's getting easier to do, but like I'm not going to buy the tools for that. And it's just not my, I don't like plumbing things where the constant, like, it's funny. In my mind, electrical work is very easy to understand potential failures, and it's very easy to know how to do it right. Whereas plumbing, it's easy to learn how to do it, but for some reason, the failure mode of a leak is scarier to me than the failure mode of electrical work, because I understand the failure modes of electrical work and how, like, to avoid them. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Thanks for watching. I hope you consider a 120 volt plug-in heat pump water heater if it's suitable to your situation. But as I said, if you have an electric water heater already and you have the space for a heat pump water heater, you should really get one. They're kind of a no-brainer. They're also cheaper than the plug-in models, which is super annoying. And they will pay for themselves in 2 or 3 years in most cases. They really are a no-brainer unless you don't have the space for one. If you have the space for one, get one. They're great. Bye.